The tray was heavier than it looked. But the weight wasn't the problem. It was the way Xavier Thorne watched the clock. His eyes narrow and transactional, as if every second Zora Williams spent breathing his air was a debt she hadn't yet repaid. The restaurant sat on a quiet stretch of Seoul, tucked away from the neon glare of the main districts. That was why Zora liked it. In a city of noise and relentless ambition, this muted corner felt like sanctuary. She had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being a shadow, a black woman in a world that often looked straight through her, moving with a practiced rhythmic efficiency. She didn't want to be special. She wanted to be forgotten. Table 4, Zora. And if you drop the tone again, you're finishing the shift on the sidewalk, Xavier muttered, his voice a low grate. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the slight smudge on her apron. To Xavier, Zora wasn't a person with a history or a heart. She was a variable in a profit margin, a ghost he paid to keep his tables clean. Zora didn't argue. She didn't even sigh. To react was to give him a hook to hang his ego on. She simply adjusted the tray, the porcelain clinking with a dull, expensive sound, and moved toward the floor. She had learned long ago that the most powerful thing you can hold is your own silence. But as she turned the corner toward the VIP booths, the air in the room changed. It wasn't a sound or a sudden movement. It was a drop in pressure, the kind that precedes a massive storm. Before we go any further into the shadows of Seoul, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had a moment where your past walked through the door when you least expected it? Drop a comment below and let me know. At table 4 there were 4 men. 3 of them were statues in dark wool coats, their presence occupying space with a practiced, violent indifference. But it was the man in the center who stopped the clock in Zora's chest. Hyung Kong. The porcelain rattled on the tray, a sharp, nervous sound that I quickly dampened with the flat of my palm. In the dim, amber-soaked light of the dining room, I was a ghost moving between the tables, efficient, silent, and entirely invisible. This was the life I had chosen, a deliberate erasure of the woman I used to be. For 3 years I had moved through Seoul like a shadow, blending into the gray architecture of the service industry, finding safety in the fact that no one ever truly looked at me. Zora, you're lagging. Xavier Thorne's voice was a cold blade, cutting through the low hum of jazz and clinking silverware. He was standing by the hostess stand, his expensive watch catching the light as he tapped the glass face. He didn't look at my face. He never did. His gaze was fixed on the floor, on the clock, on the tiny scuff on my sensible black shoes. To Xavier, I wasn't a woman who had crossed oceans to find peace. I was a malfunctioning piece of equipment that was costing him seconds of productivity. The order for table 6 is ready, I said, my voice low and devoid of the fire that used to define me. I had learned that the less space I occupied, the less reason he had to strike. Then move. I'm not paying you to stand there and contemplate the atmosphere, he snapped, his eyes narrow and transactional. He watched me as if every breath I took was a personal debt I owed his bottom line. He lived for these minor moments of authority, the petty thrills of a man who knew he was small but loved making others feel smaller. I adjusted the heavy tray, the weight of it a familiar ache in my shoulder, and turned toward the kitchen. I didn't sigh. I didn't roll my eyes. I simply let the insult slide off me, a practiced rhythmic efficiency that kept my heart rate steady and my secrets buried. The dinner rush was at its peak, a blur of steam and high-pressure demands, but I navigated it with a mask of stoic calm. I was a variable in a profit margin, a girl with no history, a shadow that existed only to serve. But as I pushed back through the swinging doors, the porcelain clinking with a dull, expensive sound, the very air in the restaurant seemed to thin. It wasn't a noise or a sudden movement. It was a drop in atmospheric pressure, the heavy, electric stillness that precedes a massive storm. The chatter of the patrons didn't stop, but it became background noise, muffled as if underwater. My footsteps faltered, a cold prickle of recognition crawling up my spine before I even saw them. At table 4, the shadows had thickened. 3 men in dark, charcoal wool coats sat like statues, their presence occupying the space with a practiced, violent indifference that made Xavier's petty cruelty look like a child's tantrum. And in the center, partially obscured by the shifting light, was the man who had stopped the clock in my chest 3 years ago. Taehyung Kong was here. The shadow had been found by the storm. The air at table 4 didn't just feel cold. It felt heavy, a localized gravity that threatened to pull the breath right out of my lungs. I approached with the practiced rhythmic efficiency I had spent 3 years perfecting, but the tray in my hand suddenly felt like it was made of lead. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a sharp staccato contrast to the absolute stillness of the men waiting for me. Xavier was hovering a few yards away, his eyes darting between the VIPs and the smudge on my sleeve, his face a mask of oily ambition. He saw them as a windfall, a high-stakes transaction that could elevate his status. He had no idea he was standing in the presence of a predator who could erase his entire world with a single phone call. I reached the table, my gaze fixed resolutely on the white tablecloth. I didn't look up. Couldn't. I focused on the task, unfolding the linen napkins and placing the heavy silverware with a steady hand that belied the chaos in my chest. I was a variable in a profit margin, I reminded myself. I was a ghost. Sparkling water for the table, I murmured, my voice a low, neutral thread. I began to pour, the water bubbling into the crystal glasses with a sound that felt deafening in the unnatural silence. That was when I felt it, the weight of a gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. Taehyung hadn't moved a muscle. He sat with his hands folded on the table, his charcoal wool coat draped over his shoulders like a shroud. He was the center of the storm, radiating a practiced, violent indifference that made the very air around him vibrate. The men flanking him were statues, their faces unreadable, but Taehyung was different. He wasn't looking at the menu. He wasn't looking at Xavier's fawning attempts to catch his eye. He was looking at me. I moved to place the glass in front of him, and for a fleeting, terrifying second, our shadows overlapped on the table. My hand hovered near his, close enough to feel the radiant heat of his skin, a warmth I had once known as well as my own. I kept my eyes down, focusing on the way the amber light caught the bubbles in the glass, but I could feel his scrutiny raking over me. He wasn't seeing the lagging waitress Xavier bullied. He was seeing the woman who had walked out of his life without a word, leaving nothing but a void in the Kong Empire. "Is there anything else, sir?" I asked, the words catching in my throat. He didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, thin and agonizing, until it felt like the glass under my fingers might shatter from the pressure. He didn't speak, but I heard everything he wasn't saying. The drop in pressure was absolute now. Xavier snapped his fingers from the periphery, a sharp, disrespectful sound intended to hurry me along, but Taehyung's eyes never flickered toward him. To Taehyung, Xavier Thorne didn't exist. The only reality in this room was the two of us and the 3 years of silence that sat between us like a jagged blade. I stepped back, my head still bowed, performing the final bow of a servant. As I turned to retreat into the safety of the shadows, I felt his gaze follow me, a cold, proprietary weight that told me the art of being invisible had just failed. The shadow had been recognized, and the storm was no longer just approaching. It had arrived. The porcelain tray slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the sideboard with a sharp, dissonant ring that seemed to echo forever in the heavy silence of the dining room. It wasn't a loud noise, but in the pressurized atmosphere of table 4, it felt like a gunshot. Xavier was on me in a heartbeat. He didn't care about the VIP's comfort or the high-stakes silence. He only saw an opportunity to reassert the dominance that the presence of the men in wool coats had somehow threatened. He grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging into the thin fabric of my uniform with a strength born of petty desperation. "Outside," he hissed, his breath smelling of bitter espresso and unearned arrogance. "Now." "The dinner rush isn't over, Xavier," I whispered, my voice trembling not with fear, but with the sudden sharp chill of the realization that Taehyung was watching this. I could feel my husband's gaze, a cold, tectonic force, anchored to the back of Xavier's head. I don't care if the city is burning down, Xavier muttered, pulling me toward the service entrance. You've been dragging your feet all night, acting like you're too good for this floor. You want to have a tone with me? You can find it in the snow. You're on street duty until the close. Maybe the frost will teach you some gratitude. He shoved me through the heavy glass door and clicked the lock. The transition was violent. One moment, I was enveloped in the amber warmth of the restaurant, the scent of roasting garlic and expensive wine clinging to my skin. The next, the Seoul winter lunged at me, a jagged, freezing blade that sliced through the short sleeves of my polyester uniform. I stood on the sidewalk, my back against the cold glass. The snow began to fall in earnest, thin white flakes spinning through the blue darkness like shards of glass. My breath came in ragged mists, visible in the glow of the street lamp. I wrapped my arms around my chest, my fingers tucking under my armpits for a warmth that wouldn't come. Through the window, the restaurant looked like an unattainable paradise. I watched Xavier return to the floor, adjusting his tie and smoothing his hair, his face illuminated by the warm, proprietary glow of his small empire. He looked back at me once, a transactional smirk playing on his lips, before turning to offer a fawning bow to table 4. I was the discarded variable again, a black woman huddled in the shadows while the world inside continued its rhythmic, expensive dance. My thin shoes were already soaking through, the slush of the sidewalk seeping into my socks with a numbing ache. I had spent 3 years trying to be a shadow, trying to be forgotten, but as I stood there shivering in the cold, I realized that invisibility had a price. It was the price of being disposable. But even through the fog of my own breath on the pane, I saw him. Taehyung hadn't moved. He remained a statue in charcoal wool, his profile sharp against the amber light. He wasn't looking at the menu Xavier was thrusting toward him. He was looking through the glass, through the reflection of the opulent room, straight at me. The blue-tinted darkness of the street felt like a stage, and for the first time in 3 years, I wasn't just a shadow. I was a wife being watched by a man who had never allowed anyone to touch what belonged to him. The cold was a physical weight, but the heat of Taehyung's stare was beginning to burn. The exile was supposed to be my punishment, but as the pressure outside began to match the storm inside, I knew Xavier Thorne had just made the last mistake of his life. The glass of the restaurant window was thick, a barrier of warmth and wealth designed to keep the world's grit at bay, but for Taehyung Kong, it had become a lens of sharpening focus. From his seat at table 4, he remained a statue of charcoal wool and absolute stillness, his posture betraying none of the seismic shift occurring beneath his skin. He watched the girl, his wife, standing in the blue-tinted darkness of the sidewalk. She looked small against the towering architecture of the city. Her shoulders hunched as she shivered in a uniform that was little more than a thin layer of polyester mockery. Her breath blossomed in the air, a fleeting ghost of mist that Xavier Thorne had tried to extinguish with a turn of a key. For 3 years, Taehyung had lived with the silence she had left behind. He had assumed it was her weapon, a way to punish him, to erase herself from a world she found too violent, too heavy. But as he watched the mist of her breath freeze against the glass, a brutal realization took hold in the pit of his stomach. Her silence wasn't a weapon. It was a cage. It was the perfected art of a woman who had been convinced that disappearing was her only safety. Beside him, Xavier was speaking, a buzzing, inconsequential sound like an insect trapped in a jar. The manager was fawning, leaning into Taehyung's space with an oily grin, explaining the standards of his establishment and how he dealt with insubordinate variables like the girl outside. Xavier believed he was displaying strength, showing a man like Taehyung that he, too, was a master of his domain. Taehyung finally turned his head. He didn't look at Xavier with anger. Anger was for people who shared the same social plane. He looked at him with a practiced, violent indifference that made the manager's smile falter mid-gesture. The air at the table didn't just drop in pressure. It became an absolute vacuum. "You sent her into the cold," Taehyung said. His voice was a low, resonant silk that carried a weight Xavier was entirely unprepared for. She was dragging her feet, Chairman, Xavier stammered, his hand going to his tie, adjusting a knot that had suddenly become too tight. Discipline is necessary for the profit margin. She'll be back in an hour, once she's learned some gratitude. Taehyung looked back through the glass. Zora had tucked her hands into her armpits, her eyes fixed on the slush at her feet. She was still trying to be a shadow, even when the world was literally freezing her out. The predator in him, the man who had built an empire on the calculation of value and the erasure of threats, felt a cold, jagged resolve lock into place. He had spent 3 years respecting her choice to be forgotten, thinking he was honoring her peace. But seeing her through the amber light of a bully's window, he realized he had been complicit in her erasure. He had allowed the queen of the Kong Empire to become a variable for a man who wasn't fit to shine her shoes. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to strike. He simply stood up, the movement slow and deliberate, a mountain rising in a room full of hills. The 3 men in wool coats stood in unison behind him, their shadows stretching across the floor like a shroud. The gratitude, Taehyung whispered, leaning close enough that Xavier could smell the sandalwood and the impending storm, is a debt you are about to pay in full. The glass was no longer a barrier. It was a countdown. As Taehyung moved toward the door, he wasn't just walking to retrieve a waitress. He was walking to break the cage, and he didn't care how much of Xavier Thorne's world he had to shatter to do it. The heavy glass door didn't just open. It swung wide with a force that seemed to pull the very oxygen from the room. I was still huddled against the exterior brick, my fingers numb and my breath coming in shallow, icy hitches, when the shadow of a man eclipsed the street lamp's glow. I didn't have to look up to know it was him. The air around me suddenly possessed a localized heat, a familiar scent of sandalwood and cold rain that pushed back the soul winter. Taehyung didn't say a word as he reached out. His hand, warm and larger than I remembered, settled firmly on my arm, not with the pinching, petty grip Xavier had used, but with a proprietary strength that signaled the end of my exile. He drew me back across the threshold, and as the door clicked shut behind us, the silence in the restaurant was so absolute it felt like a physical weight. Xavier was standing by the hostess station, his face a pale mask of confusion that was rapidly souring into indignation. He hadn't expected the chairman to move, let alone to personally retrieve a variable from the sidewalk. He stepped forward, his mouth opening to reassert the small-scale order of his world. "Chairman Kong, please, you don't need to concern yourself with the staff," Xavier began, his voice pitching higher in a desperate attempt to maintain the hierarchy. "She was being disciplined for her incompetence. Zora, get back to the kitchen and—" Taehyung didn't stop walking. He led me straight to the center of the dining floor, forcing Xavier to retreat or be trampled. When Taehyung finally turned, his expression was a terrifying study in practiced violent indifference. He didn't look like a man having a disagreement. He looked like a god deciding which part of a temple to pull down first. "You spoke of discipline," Taehyung said, his voice a low, resonant silk that vibrated through the floorboards. He didn't raise his tone, yet every patron in the room stopped breathing. "You spoke of her value to your profit margin." Xavier swallowed hard, his hand fluttering to his tie. "It's just business, sir. Standards must be kept." Taehyung's grip on my arm tightened slightly, a silent reassurance before he let go to take a slow, deliberate step toward Xavier. The 3 men in charcoal wool coats moved in perfect synchronization, forming a semicircle behind their leader. The restaurant's hierarchy, the one where Xavier sat at the top and I sat at the bottom, didn't just crumble, it vanished. "You have spent the night looking at her apron, her shoes, and your clock," Taehyung whispered, leaning in until he was inches from Xavier's sweating face. "But you never once looked at her. If you had, you might have realized that you aren't the master of this house. You are merely a tenant in a world she allows you to inhabit." Xavier's eyes darted to me, then back to the chairman, the first flickers of a soul-crushing realization beginning to dawn on him. He looked at the way I stood, no longer hunched, no longer trying to be a shadow, but standing in the radiant heat of Taehyung's protection. I don't understand, Xavier stammered, his bravado finally breaking. That is your greatest failure, Mr. Thorne, Taehyung replied, his eyes turning to flint. You miscalculated the value of the woman in front of you. And in my world, a mistake of that magnitude carries a price that your profit margin cannot cover. The silence that followed was the broken kind, the kind that occurs after a foundation snaps. For 3 years I had perfected the art of being a shadow, but as I stood in the center of the room, the amber light no longer felt like a hiding place. Felt like a spotlight. The hierarchy was gone, and for the first time since I arrived in Seoul, the weight I was carrying wasn't the tray. It was the crown. The silence in the restaurant was no longer empty. It was a pressurized vacuum that seemed to suck the air right out of Xavier's lungs. He stood frozen, his hand still hovering near his silk tie, looking like a man who had suddenly realized the ground beneath his feet was actually a trapdoor. Taehyung didn't move, yet his presence seemed to expand. His dark wool coat casting a shadow that made the restaurant's opulent gold leaf molding look cheap and gaudy. You find power in the clock, Mr. Thorne, Taehyung said, his voice a low, terrifyingly calm vibration. You find authority in the cold and the lock on a door. You believe that because you own the walls, you own the people within them. Xavier tried to speak, his mouth working like a landed fish, but no sound came out. The statues in charcoal coats behind Taehyung remained perfectly still, their very existence a silent promise of the violence Taehyung didn't even need to exert. The wealthy patrons at the surrounding tables had stopped their hushed conversations, their expensive dinners cooling as they watched the dismantling of a man who, moments ago, had been their fawning host. I've spent the evening observing your standards, Taehyung continued, taking a single measured step forward. Xavier stumbled back, his heel catching on the carpet. You treat a queen like a variable in a profit margin. You look at her heritage and see a weakness to be exploited, rather than a lineage that could crush your world in a single afternoon. Taehyung turned his gaze to me, and for a second, the mask of violent indifference cracked just enough for me to see the raw, burning pride beneath. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a heavy, black-mirrored card, tossing it onto the table with a flick of his wrist. It didn't slide. It landed with a weighted thud that sounded like a gavel. By tomorrow morning, the lease on this building will be held by the Kong Group, Taehyung whispered. The blood drained from Xavier's face until he was the color of the white linens. The standard of this establishment is no longer yours to dictate. You aren't a master, Xavier. You are a low-level distraction that I am weary of looking at. Xavier's eyes darted frantically to the staff, the chefs in the doorway, the other waitresses huddled by the bar, looking for a shred of the loyalty he thought he had bought with fear. But there was nothing. They watched him with the same practiced rhythmic efficiency I had used, their faces blank as they witnessed his absolute liquidation. He was being erased in real time, stripped of the ego he had built by demeaning those he thought were beneath him. I didn't know, Xavier finally managed to gasp, his voice breaking into a pathetic, high-pitched whimper. If I had known she was. That is precisely why you are nothing, Taehyung interrupted, his eyes turning to ice. Respect that is only given when power is recognized is not respect, it is cowardice. You didn't see the queen because you were too busy worshipping the clock. Taehyung offered me his arm, his expression softening into a quiet, lethal invitation. I looked at Xavier one last time, the man who had sent me into the cold, the man who had looked at the smudge on my apron and missed the soul of the woman wearing it. He looked small. He looked disposable. As I placed my hand on the sleeve of Taehyung's charcoal coat, the weight of the tray was gone for good. I wasn't the waitress anymore. I wasn't the shadow. I was Zora Williamskung, the queen who had finally come in from the cold, and as we walked toward the door, the entire room, staff and elite alike, lowered their heads in a silent collective bow. The storm had passed, and in its wake, only the empire remained. The car ride toward the river was a study in pressurized silence. The interior of the black Maybach felt like a vault, insulated from the city outside, the smells of leather and Taehyung's cold, clean cologne filling the space. I stared at my hands, resting against the heavy charcoal wool of the jacket he had draped over my shoulders. The emerald on my finger, long hidden by work gloves and shadows, seemed to pulse with a dark, liquid fire in the dim blue light of the dashboard. We stopped near a secluded stretch of the Han River, where the city lights bled into the dark water like spilled ink. Taehyung didn't get out. He stayed in the driver's seat, his large hands resting on the steering wheel, his profile as sharp and unyielding as the jade pins I used to wear. 3 years, Zora, he said. His voice was a low vibration, the kind that precedes a massive storm. I spent 3 years respecting a silence that was killing me, thinking I was giving you the peace you asked for. I didn't think I'd find you serving water to a man who wasn't fit to breathe your air. I looked out at the river, the mist rising from the water mimicking the cold breath I'd exhaled on the sidewalk only an hour ago. I wasn't looking for peace, Taehyung. I was looking for safety. In your world, being seen is a death sentence. I thought if I became a shadow, if I became a variable in someone else's profit margin, the ghosts would stop following me. The ghosts didn't follow you, he countered, finally turning to look at me. His dark eyes were unfathomable, a mix of practiced violent indifference and a raw, jagged grief. I kept them away. I've spent every night since you left ensuring that the world stayed quiet enough for you to hide. But seeing you in the cold, seeing that man put his hands on you. He trailed off, his jaw tightening until the bone looked like it might snap. You weren't supposed to find me, I whispered. My voice felt thin, stripped of the stoic mask I'd worn for Xavier. I worked so hard to be forgotten. I liked the weight of the tray because it was a burden I chose. It was better than the weight of a crown I never asked for. Taehyung reached out, his thumb grazing the line of my jaw with a deliberate gentleness that made my breath hitch. You didn't choose the tray, Zora. You chose a cage because you were afraid of the storm. But look at your hands. He took my hand in his skin warm and proprietary. You've spent 3 years perfecting the art of being a shadow, yet even in a stained apron, you commanded that room. You didn't run because you were weak. You ran because you knew that if you stayed, you'd eventually have to become the monster I am to survive. The emotional core of our past, the nights spent in the penthouse discussing empires, the shared blood and shared secrets, sat between us like a jagged blade. Our bond was far from certain. It was a connection forged in the darkness of the Kong Empire, rooted in a loyalty that felt more like a shackle than a vow. The silence is over, he said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous silk. You can go back to your apartment. You can try to find another corner of Seoul to hide in. But I won't let you be invisible again. I won't let the world treat a queen like a ghost. I looked at him, searching for the man I had married and finding only the chairman. The transition was absolute. The art of being a shadow had failed, and as the moon reflected off the emerald on my finger, I realized the river wasn't the only thing that was deep and dangerous. The past hadn't just walked through the door, it had reclaimed the room. The car remained parked by the river, a dark sanctuary against the encroaching dawn. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of sandalwood and the unspoken weight of a decision that would either bury my past or ignite my future. Taehyung reached into the console and pulled out a heavy, velvet-lined box. When he opened it, the interior of the Maybach seemed to ignite. Resting on a bed of black silk was a traditional binyeo, a hairpin of pure, deep jade, and a high-tensile security badge for the Kong Group's global headquarters. This isn't just jewelry, Zora, Taehyung said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous silk that made my pulse race. The jade belongs to the wife of the chairman. The badge belongs to the woman who will oversee our expansion into the West. You spent 3 years perfecting the art of being a shadow, but tonight the world saw the queen. You cannot go back to being a variable in a profit margin. The cage is broken. I looked at the jade, then at the badge, the cold metal reflecting the city lights. My mind flashed back to the restaurant, to the way Xavier had looked at me with such transactional cruelty, and the way I had let him. I thought about the weight of the tray, the ache in my shoulders that had become a comfort because it was a burden I could understand. That life was safe. It was quiet. It was a slow, rhythmic erasure that guaranteed no one would ever hunt me again. If I take that badge, I whispered, my voice trembling with the magnitude of the choice, I'm not just Zora anymore. I'm a target. I'm the woman who stands beside the storm. You are already a target, Taehyung countered, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that felt like a physical anchor. Xavier Thorne saw a waitress he could bully. The next man will see a woman he can break. The only difference is that with me, you have the power to break them first. You ran from the darkness, Zora, but you forgot that you are the only one who knows how to navigate it. I reached out, my fingers hovering over the jade. The internal struggle was a jagged blade, cutting through my desire for peace. I wanted the safety of being forgotten, the smallness of a life where the only thing at stake was a smudge on an apron. But as I looked at Taehyung, I realized that the quiet life was a lie I had been telling myself. I wasn't at peace in that restaurant. I was in hiding. I wasn't safe. I was just waiting for the cold to catch up to me. The throne isn't made of gold, Zora, he added, his hand finding mine. His grip firm and proprietary. It's made of emeralds and steel. It's dangerous and it's heavy. But it is yours. You can walk back to your apartment now, and I will ensure you are never bothered again. Or you can take the jade, and we can show this city why the shadows should be afraid of us. The silence in the car stretched, thin and electric. I looked at the river, the water now a bruise of purple and gold as the sun began to peek over the horizon. I thought about the woman who had shivered on the sidewalk, and the woman who had watched a mafia boss dismantle her bully with a single word. I haven't picked up the jade yet. But I didn't pull my hand away from his. The choice was a threshold, and as the light of the new day touched the emerald on my finger, I realized that some storms aren't meant to be outrun. They are meant to be led. The sun began to rise over the Han River, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, but the warmth of the dawn felt different this time. It wasn't the distant, mocking light I had watched from the sidewalk, but a herald of the transition I was finally ready to make. I looked at the jade pin in the velvet box, its deep green surface reflecting a history of women who had survived much worse than a cruel manager in a mid-tier restaurant. I reached out and picked up the jade. The stone was cold, yet as I slid it into the silk-wrapped coil of my hair, it felt like a final piece of armor locking into place. My fingers didn't tremble. The perfected art of being a shadow hadn't been a waste of time, I realized. It had been a period of observation, a sharpening of the senses. My silence hadn't been a cage of weakness, but a gathering of strength, a quiet breathing space before the inevitable strike of the storm. I'm not going back to the apartment, Taehyung, I said, my voice no longer a neutral thread, but a steady, resonant command that matched the hum of the engine. And I'm not going back to being invisible. If I'm to be a target, then let's give them something worth aiming at. Taehyung's expression didn't shift into a smile. He was still the chairman, still the predator, but the practiced violent indifference in his eyes was replaced by a look of profound, dangerous respect. He reached over and took the restaurant's brass key from my pocket, the one Xavier had used to lock me in the cold, and tossed it out the window into the dark currents of the river. The variable is gone, he murmured. The queen has returned. We drove back to the restaurant one last time. It was nearly morning, the night shift winding down. The marquee lights were flickering, looking weary and dim in the encroaching daylight. Xavier was still there, visible through the glass, slumped at a booth with his head in his hands, the weight of his imminent professional liquidation already visible in the set of his shoulders. He looked up as the Maybach pulled to the curb, his face a pale mask of terror. I stepped out of the car, no longer hunched, no longer shielding myself from the world. I walked into the restaurant with my head held high, the emerald on my finger and the jade in my hair catching the morning light. I didn't look at Xavier. I didn't need to see his ruin to feel my own victory. I simply walked to the locker room, retrieved the few belongings that truly belonged to Zora Williams, and left the stained apron on the floor. It was a shroud I was finished wearing. As I walked back out, Taehyung was waiting by the open door of the car. The statues in wool coats stood at attention, their heads bowed in a silent, collective acknowledgement of the woman I had become. The staff watched from the kitchen, their eyes wide as they realized the shadow they had worked beside was the brightest light in the city. I took Taehyung's arm, feeling the solid, unyielding strength of the empire I was now a part of. We didn't look back at the restaurant or the small, broken man inside. We looked straight ahead, toward the skyline of Seoul and the high-power life that waited beyond the horizon. The revenge was over, the exile was finished, and the gathering storm had finally broken. I was Zora Williams-kung, and I was finally, irrevocably ready to be seen.